have started the venture, but even to the rest of the world, that yes, there are people who believe in that venture, believe in the potential of the venture. So it plays out at various levels. And today, to talk about funding, especially for startups, we have with us Dr. Dhruv Nath. Dr. Dhruv Nath is an IIT Delhi alumnus. He did his BTech and the PhD from IIT Delhi. Post his BTech and PhD, he joined NIT, where he spent close to 2 decades at the organization. Before he moved on to management, MDI Gurgaon, Management Development Institute Gurgaon, where he's again almost done 2 decades of teaching. It was at MDI many years ago, almost I think 13, 14 years ago, that when I first met up with him. And he's truly a great person to work with. While he's so senior, he's so young at his heart, and it doesn't make you feel anyways lower than himself when he interacts with you. And he's an amazing person. So apart from having had a very good corporate career and a great teaching stint, he has also been consulting a lot of big companies in their ventures, in their business. And more recently, recently by I mean not recently in months, but recently in relation to his own work career of almost 4 decades, he's been into the startups as an angel investor, and he's a director of Lead Angels, and he's been quite active with a lot of startups. And he's also been an author of many books, and the most recent one of them being Funding Your Startup. That's his more recent book, where he is talking about how funding challenges are there for startup, and many other interesting stories that he has put together. And very good read. Of course, recommended to everybody who are on today's webinar to go there. It's available on Amazon. The link of that is there in the email that you had received from Propel to register for this webinar. Without taking much of time, I would now invite Dr. Dhruv Nath to share his thoughts on funding a startup, and hopefully he will help you not get too many nightmares with this. And so pleasure to have you, Dhruv Nath ji, here. And I'm looking forward to your interaction with the people here. As a simple one, before I hand over, you can put your queries and questions in the chat box for this meeting. And after Mr. Dhruv Nath has finished his presentation, we would be happy to take those queries and discuss that and have an interactive session. All yours, Dr. Dhruv Nath.
Thanks, boss. Thank you so much. Can you guys hear me clearly?
You're quite loud and clear.
Okay.
Nice.
बहुत बढ़िया. Actually, anybody who's been a professor for 20 years, आवाज अपने आप ना, it becomes powerful. Okay. Thanks so much, Devinder. So, by the way, one thing which just hold on. Let me just switch off my phone. Yeah. So one of the things that is common between Devinder is a very old friend. He's not very old, but he's an old friend. I must clarify.
Thank you.
So one thing which is common between him and me is both of us spent many years in the industry. Both of us kept chasing business targets, sales targets. Both of us said, "Bahut ho gaya, enough is enough," and we quit and joined academics. And I think both of us are extremely happy at the decision that we took. Right?
That's right.
And we keep comparing notes. So thanks, boss, for inviting me over. And what I will do is, let me just share my screen. Yeah, so I assume you guys can now see my screen.
It's visible.
Yeah, okay. So as Professor Devinder Singh mentioned, last 6-7 years, I have been an angel investor. And by the way, I must clarify, I am not a typical rich angel investor. I am not in the Ratan Tata or the Nandan Nilekani category. Okay, I am what is called an Aam Aadmi angel investor. No connection with Kejriwal. Aam Aadmi basically means common man who puts in 5 lakhs, 10 lakhs into an investment. Right? And I've been doing this for the last 6 years. And I have been with Lead Angels. And my colleague at Lead Angels, Sushanto, who's the co-author of the book, he has been doing it for about 20 years. So what we've realized over the past so many years is that there is a lot in common between startups which succeed, and similarly there is a lot in common between startups which fail, right? And having studied so many startups, so I have invested in about 12 or 13, and I must have mentored about 50, 60 odd. Having studied so many startups, what we did was we tried to create a framework uh, which any startup founder could use to evaluate his startup and figure out whether there was a likelihood of it getting successful or not. Number one. Number two, whether he was likely to get funding or not. All right. And that framework is what I will talk about right now. And that framework, by the way, is the subject of the book. So the book, like Devinder mentioned, has lots of stories about startups, some failures, some successes. What I will do is, in today's talk, I'll do it in three parts. Part one is going to be the I'll talk about one story which I have personally been involved in. In fact, I've invested in that company. Part two, I will talk about the framework which I keep mentioning, and I will try and analyze that one startup which I'm talking about in the context of that framework, and what do investors look for. And part three obviously is questions. Anything you'd like to ask, you're most welcome. Yeah. So part one first. The story I want to take up is called Aha Taxis, right? And some of you may be aware of this. So basically, this guy is in the business of taxis for outstation travel. You know, if you look at guys like Uber and Ola, they are essentially into in-city travel, right? Within Delhi, within Bangalore, within Bombay. This guy is outstation. And what he focuses on is one-way travel, because there will be many situations where, let's say you want to go from Delhi to Lucknow, but you have a train ticket back, right? So you don't want a taxi on the way back. Similarly, you go from Delhi to Lucknow, but you don't know when you're coming back, and you don't want to hang on to a taxi for those many days. So what you want is a one-way taxi from city A to city B. Now, there is a fundamental problem, and I'm sure many of you face this with one-way travel, which is every taxi has what we call a base city or a base town, right? So let's say you want to go from Delhi to Lucknow, you take a taxi from Delhi, right? And the base city for the taxi would be Delhi. The problem is this taxi, no passenger can take this taxi from any other town other than the base city, right? So once the guy has reached Lucknow, he can't get a passenger on the way back, right? Which means he returns empty. So you want to travel one way, Delhi to Lucknow, but the poor taxi wala will travel one way, get a passenger. On the way back, he's empty, and therefore he says, "Boss, I will charge you two-way fare. You want one way? No problem. That's your problem. I will charge you two-way fare." Right? And that's a fundamental problem where you travel one way, but you pay two-way fare. Okay. So what our taxis did was they said this seems to be a big problem. Let's try and solve it. So what they did was they said, okay, we will onboard several taxi operators. And at last count, I think they had some 30, 40,000 taxi operators. What they did was they said, okay, now that we have these guys as partners, we can communicate with them wherever they are. It's very much like Ola and Uber, right? Because Ola can communicate with their taxi driver irrespective of where he is in the city. Similarly, these guys could communicate with the taxi driver, whether he was in Agra or in Lucknow or Bareilly or Kanpur or wherever. Now, because they can communicate wherever you are, they can provide you passengers on the way back, right? So if there is a taxi which is sitting idle in Lucknow and there is a customer who wants to come from Lucknow to Delhi, no problem. I will allocate this taxi to this customer. So which means that the taxi was provided effectively two-way fare by two-way passengers by our taxis, and therefore they said, "ठीक है, we will only charge you one-way fare for each trip." And our taxi said, "Okay, this one-way fare, I will add my commission of maybe 10-15%, and that's it." Therefore, the customer will be charged one-way fare plus 10 to 15% more. Right? So they solved the problem. Now, I want to explain in a brief the process that these guys followed. So, what happens is, the customer asks for a booking. Typically, you will go to the website, ask for a booking, and AHA taxis will give them a fare based on past data. Right? Right now, they don't know which taxi they're going to allocate. Now, the customer does the booking, so the customer has got a taxi, but he still doesn't know which taxi. Now, AHA taxis will manually check. Remember, manually. They will keep phoning up. They'll send SMSs to all possible operators who are in that city. And they will ask them, boss, आपको आना है, आपको आना है, आपको आना है, आप free हो? People will say, हाँ, मैं free हूँ, मैं इतना charge करूँगा. And finally, AHA taxis will allocate one taxi based on these responses. But please remember, this is manual. So now, obviously, rates could vary depending on seasonality, but this is how our taxis allocates a taxi. Okay, good. So that completes a little bit of the our taxi story. Now I will talk about the framework, and the framework, by the way, is what I call persistent. Right, and this is the framework that we have in this book. So incidentally, this is the book, Funding Your Startup and Other Nightmares. As you can see, I have a copy of the book. Yeah. Okay. And as you also notice, Devinder is an old friend, but he hasn't yet bought a copy of the book. Okay,
It's on the way. I was trying to buy the Kindle thing and I realized that for some reason I can't buy from Kindle India, but I can only buy from Kindle USA.
That is very
So I'm trying to
strange.
sort.
That is
Yeah,
very
so something.
strange.
Yeah, so I must have made some changes to my profile on
Okay.
Amazon.
Okay.
So which I have to change it back to Kindle India.
Or maybe Amazon knows that you're a rich guy. You earned a
हाँ, तो
lot of
डॉलर
money in
चेपो
Coca-Cola.
इसको डॉलर चेपो.
Dollar chip. And dollar price is always higher. खरीद लो बॉस मेरे को
No,
रॉयल्टी
no,
उससे
it's
मैं
on the
आपको
way.
ट्रीट
So I've
करूंगा.
ordered so the physical copy is on the way.
Okay, fit. Anyway, so persistent is the framework, right? And each letter in the word persistent stands for something. All right. So let's take the first letter, which is P. P stands for problem. Are you solving a problem for the customer? Because please remember, if you're not solving a problem for the customer, बॉस कुछ नहीं होने वाला, कोई आपको पे नहीं करेगा, you will not get business. Your startup will fail, right? So obviously in the case of our taxis, you are solving a problem because the customer wants one-way travel and you're charging him one-way fare as against two-way fare. So you're solving a problem. You're cutting down his expenses by not to half, but to maybe 60%, right? Because there is also that commission. Okay, second issue. Do you have an earnings model? Okay, which basically means, are you getting money from somewhere, right? And here clearly you are getting money because you're making that 10 to 15% commission on every trip that the customer makes, right? So that's number two. And please note, each of these is one letter in the word persistent, right? So P and E I have covered so far. Third, size of the market. So I'm assuming, since there are about, I think 25 odd people in this batch, I'm assuming many of you want to create a startup. How many of you want to create a startup which stagnates? नहीं बॉस मेरे को 10 लाख से ऊपर नहीं जाना है. आई एम वेरी हैप्पी विद 10 lakh revenue. उसके आगे मेरे को जाने का नहीं है. Obviously not. Yeah? You want to create a startup because you want to grow something which grows, right? And which grows and grows and hopefully becomes big, right? Maybe ultimately a unicorn. So you can grow big only if the size of the market in which you're operating is large. Otherwise you can't, right? So one of the things you have to look at when you're creating a startup is what is the size of the market I'm operating in. And clearly in the case of our taxis, it's a huge market because you have people traveling outstation all the time and large number of them would want one-way taxis, right? So it's a large market, not a problem. That's not an issue at all. Next question, scalability. So you may have a large market, but can you scale up rapidly within that market? Yeah. Can you grow rapidly? Can you grow fast? And that's important because, if you don't grow fast, please remember lots of people have the same bright idea as you. You don't grow fast, the other guy is going to grow fast and possibly kill you. And he's competition, right? So scalability becomes another extremely important issue. Right? And what I'll do is for 2 minutes, I'll just try and analyze the scalability of our taxis. Just recall what I had said. Their process is manual, right? And whenever you have manual processes, solidly manual processes, you are less scalable. For the simple reason that if you want to increase the number of trips, you have to add that much manpower, right? Otherwise, you can't manage. And if you have to add that much manpower, you have to add that much office space, that much infrastructure, that many workstations, and so on. So that is not a scalable model. Technology makes it scalable. The more the manual involvement, the less the scalability. Agreed? So now, what our taxis did over time was they actually made it very scalable because they said, okay, we will develop an app and all our taxi operators, 40,000 right now, will download this app, right? Now, anytime a customer does a booking, the system automatically sends a message out to the appropriate taxi operators in that who operate in that area. Yeah. Obviously, if you're trying to travel from Lucknow to Kanpur, it won't send it to operators who are based in Bangalore. Doesn't make sense, right? But to the appropriate guys, it will send off. And the taxis will then bid. Somebody will say, मैं 1000 charge करूंगा. Somebody will say, मैं 950 charge करूंगा. And the system will then automatically pick up the lowest bid, right? So essentially, in place of a manual process, our taxis went to an automated process, and automated processes are more scalable. And please remember that, whenever you are creating your own startup, the more the technology you use, the more the scalability you have. All right. Okay. Next. So I've so far covered 4 things. The fifth thing, risks, right? Obviously, every business has risks, right? And you need to understand what your risks are. Now, in the case of our taxis, the biggest risk is the risk of competition coming in, right? Particularly huge competition like Uber. Suppose Uber says, boss, I want to get into intercity one-way taxis. I mean, that's a huge guy, and he can sustain losses for years, and our taxis will not be able to compete with him, right? So that's a risk. So one of the things you need to do to be able to take care of risks is what we call build an entry barrier. And I've got that on the right hand side of this slide. Right? So entry barrier is what? This is my business, right? I will do something within this business so that my competitor is not able to get in and not able to compete with me, or at least he finds it difficult to enter the same business. And because he finds it difficult to enter the same business, I will call it an entry barrier, right? And by the way, obviously one very good possibility for an entry barrier is what we call innovation, right? So for example, if you have an innovative solution, like for instance, if you have a product and you have a patent for that product, then you have a good entry barrier because the other guy then cannot copy you, right? So you need to have an entry barrier for any business that you start. Let's look at our taxis. What is the entry barrier for them? Actually, initially it was fairly low because anybody could do this business, right? Anybody can do it. But over time, what happened was the app-based bidding system became some kind of barrier because a competitor would have to create a similar app-based bidding system, which would have taken him 3 to 4 months. So, our taxis therefore was 3 to 4 months ahead of any potential competitor. Second, with scaling up, when I say scaling up, I mean more and more taxis getting added on. The number of taxis became an entry barrier. And you need to understand why. See, let's assume that you want to go from Kanpur to, say, Bareilly. Okay. Now, if you have only 100 taxis on your rolls, there is a good possibility that at the time that the customer wants a cab, which is, let's say, 11th November, 2 p.m., no taxi is available because you don't have too many. But our taxis are such a large number of taxis that there is a very good chance that a taxi will be available for the date and time that that guy wants in the Kanpur to Bareilly sector, right? So a large number of taxi operators makes it a bit of an entry barrier, because your competitor then has to get access to so many taxis, and that will take him time, right? So again, you've created a bit of an entry barrier. And of course, the third entry barrier, which builds up over time, as Professor Singh would tell you, the brand would be a very, very strong entry barrier. So, even you look at what Devinder Singh has been doing. He was in Coca-Cola. Somebody can create a drink which is, the taste is very similar, but people will not buy it. People buy the brand Coke. Boss, mere ko pata hai. I trust it, right? I'll buy the brand Coke. So the brand also becomes an entry barrier over time. In general, you'll find the entry barrier for any business builds up over time. It's not something you can expect on day one. Okay, so what we've looked at so far is all of these, and please note, these are all part of the word persistent, the acronym persistent. Then the question is, what do you do if the market is crowded? Which means you already have lots of businesses, lots of competitors in the same market. So look at our taxis again, right? If you look at outstation taxis, it's a hugely crowded market, hugely crowded, right? For example, I live in Greater Kailash Part 2 in Delhi, right? In my colony, there must be at least about 7 or 8 different local taxi stands. And all of them have outstation taxis, and they'll all be willing to provide you with the outstation taxi. So it's a hugely unorganized, crowded market. Why would our taxis succeed? If you are in a crowded market, try and identify a subset of that market which is large enough, right? A subset of the market which is not crowded, right? So what our taxis did was, they realized outstation taxi is a hugely crowded marketplace, but within that, the one-way taxi business is not crowded, and therefore we will get in only into one-way taxi. Yes, they also do two-way taxis, but their primary business line is one-way, right? So what you need to do if the market is crowded is to identify a, what I call, a large enough niche or a subset of the crowded market which is not crowded. All right. So that brings me to almost the end of persistent, but a couple of other important things I want to add. Number one, you need to look at traction. Nico was very simple. You can have a brilliant solution to the to some customer's problem, great earnings model. You've taken care of risks, highly scalable, innovative, patent hai, ye hai, wo hai. But till you actually get customers, until the customer base keeps growing month on month, year on year, quarter on quarter, your business is not viable, right? So ultimately, the proof of the entire business is not what you have on your Excel or your PPT, but the actual customers who come and pay you. And that is what I call traction. And at the end of the day, you therefore need customers to, more and more customers to come, sticky customers, which means once they come, hopefully too many of them don't leave, right? So that's traction. And the final thing, which I'll mention here, is the team, which basically is the founder and the rest of the gang. And I mention this because, you know, team, the founder, at least in the early stages, investors look more at the founder than at the business itself. For the simple reason that if there are changes to be made in the business, right, you have to pivot the business, you have to tweak the business model. A good founder, a solid founder will make sure it happens. But if you have a great business with an average founder, wo nahi chalega, right? So founder becomes extremely important, and he is the head of the team. Yeah? So this completes my persistent model, and you can go through each one of them: problem, earnings model, risk, size of the market, innovation, scalability, team, entry barrier, niche, and finally traction, right? So that is the persistent framework, which we strongly recommend every startup founder uses to analyze his startup, right? So That's our model. Now, I want to add one more interesting thing. Persistent is also an English word, right? And persistent means what? Persevering. You keep on and on and on and on at it, right? Um, you must remember, if you're creating a startup, if you're running a business, it's no joke. You will have ups and downs. You'll probably have more downs than ups. But you've got to hang in there. You've got to keep on and on and on at it. आजकल देखो बस सबको आजकल कोविड हो गया. Many businesses are in deep trouble, but they've got to hang in there. They've got to keep on saying, "ठीक है, somehow we got to figure out a way to survive and get over this COVID period." Right? So you've got to be persistent, right? And Aha Taxis, by the way, the founder was extremely persistent because when he came to us for funding, we rejected him. We said, "No, boss, this is not a viable model. We don't think it will work." And there are too many issues, safety issues, insurance issues, वगैरह वगैरह वगैरह. He said, "Boss, मैं छोड़ूंगा नहीं." So he went to another angel network. He got funded from there, and then he came back to us 1 year later, and he says, "Okay, now my model, I can prove to you it is working." And we said, "Yes, it is working." So then we funded him at a higher valuation, right? So this guy didn't give up. He says, "Boss, मेरे को funding लेनी है. कोई मना करेगा, कोई बात नहीं. I'm going to get funding," right? So not only is the framework important, the English meaning of the word persistent is equally important. Okay. So I have so far talked about the framework that you need to follow for creating a successful startup. By the way, I must tell you, this is not a guarantee. There's no guarantees in life, right, or in business. This only makes sure that you have a better chance of succeeding, right? Nobody guarantees business. Now I come to funding, which is the issue Devinder had raised. What do investors look for? Actually, if you think about it, frankly, if you think about it, investors and founders have exactly the same objective in mind, right? Both want a successful startup, both want the startup to grow, both want the startup to be able to handle competition, both want the startup to build up a solid brand to have traction, and ultimately to start making a profit, right? So both want exactly the same things, which is why I'll go a step further and say what the investor wants is exactly the same. So the founder should evaluate his startup from the point of view of the persistent framework, and the investor also evaluates the startup from the same point of view, right? Same framework. So in fact, now having created this framework after studying a lot of startups, even I, and in fact, most of us at Lead Angels, we now have started using this framework. So we will ask these questions. Boss, are you solving a problem? How big is the market? Innovative hai kuch solution, or is it just a run-of-the-mill solution? What's your entry barrier? Will your entry barrier grow with time? Right? We'll evaluate the team. So we will follow exactly the same thing as investors. And therefore, when I talk about funding your startup, if you want a successful journey towards funding and ultimately creating a good, solid, growing startup, please follow the persistent framework. That's my advice to all of you, young people and maybe not so young people out there. So, yeah. So I think that concludes part 2, which was funding. And I guess at this stage, if you guys have questions, maybe I'll stop sharing my screen now. Yeah. So at this stage, if you guys have questions, please, you're most welcome to ask. I don't guarantee that I'll answer them because I don't have all the answers, but you're most welcome to ask. And I must tell you, very often I learn a hell of a lot from young people like you. Oh, by the way, I can see Ajay Mohan Goyal. Arey, Ajay Mohan Goyal used to be an old colleague of mine. Old nahi, बहुत young hai, but he used to be my colleague at NIT. क्या हाल है यार?
Yeah, Ajay, that's right. Let me unmute Ajay.
Hi, Dhruv. How are you, boss?
Good, Dhruv. Nice to see you. I made it a point to reach home on time from university and attend your.
Thank you so much. चाय पिएगा?
हाँ
भेजो?
पीऊंगा, please send it
भेजो?
through our taxi.
अच्छा नहीं यार, वो इंटर सिटी है, तुम इंट्रा सिटी हो, वो उबर से जानी
I'm in
पड़ेगी.
Noida. I'm in Noida. You're in Delhi. So inter.
Yeah, but our taxis will not take Delhi Noida.
Okay.
All right, I think while people are thinking of putting in their queries or questions in the chat, I have, I mean, very interesting, this persistent framework that you spoke about. And you said, the investors are looking exactly the same thing. But tell me, I mean, why is it that one investor funds AHA taxis and the other one does not? Or for that matter, one investor funds that one venture and the others don't, if they're looking at the same thing. Why is that the case?
So you're absolutely right. So you see, persistent. So first of all, I must tell you, investors do not follow exactly this framework. This is a framework we have created. They will, I mean, they may not even be using the same terms, but by and large, they'll follow the same kind of questions. Because, in this framework, a lot of these things are subjective, right?
Mhm.
So for example, let's look at team. Let's look at the founder. One investor will say, boss, I am really gung-ho. This guy is a real miracle. He is very persistent. He's very, very pushy. वो काम कर देगा. The other investor will say, यार, what I don't like is this guy doesn't have attention to detail. मैं उसमें पैसे नहीं डालूंगा. So, a lot of these things become highly subjective. So, for instance, let's take a thing like entry barrier, right? A lot of investors, in our case, felt if Ola, by the way, when AHA taxis came for investment, Ola was already into intercity, but that was not their prime focus area, right? So a lot of investors felt, look, boss, if Ola, Uber get in, then AHA taxis is doomed, right? That is one view, which is absolutely true. The other view is if Ola or Uber want to get into intercity taxis, rather than building it up from scratch, the best option is to buy out our taxis, right? Because they've already done all the hard work, right? So one investor says, boss, I'm willing to take a chance of them buying it out. And the other guy says, nahi yaar, entry barrier nahi hoga if Ola gets in. So, the guidelines are similar, but most of these are subjective. And by the way, AHA taxis today has been bought out. It has been bought out by a very interesting company called Ebix Cash. See, Ebix Cash is now a market leader in travel in India. And today, they in fact had bought Yatra, right? But of course, that didn't go through because of COVID. By the way, somebody on chat has said Ola is into intercity. You're right. Ola has been into intercity, except that that is not a focus area for them. And definitely, one-way intercity is not a focus area for them.
Right. No, that's just very interesting. What you said is that, find a niche. And you said big enough niche.
Yeah.
And I think in a way, what you're really referring to, or at least the way I see it is, find yourself that distinction which you can own, and it should not be and it should be a big enough market for you to be working on. So it's a differentiation that you create.
Bilkul. What's your
Sometime back,
USP? What's your USP?
Like a USP. That's
Correct.
right. That's
Correct.
right. That's it. I mean, and that's a very true thing, even in beverages. Long time back, Coke and Pepsi used to be the two big guys, and then came one small guy called Red Bull. Okay, so they picked up a very clear domain which was not interesting enough, not big enough for the big guys, but was big enough for them to start and build themselves.
Correct.
And I think that's exactly what a startup does, really. Pick up something which is obvious to many people, but they do not pick it up because it's not worth it. But they can make it worth the while over the time.
You're absolutely. So, so Devinder, just to add my comment to this, if you have, let's say, let's take Make My Trip. Now, Make My Trip is a mammoth, right? If anybody says, look, I want to create an online travel portal, I would say, don't be silly. You cannot compete with Make My Trip.
Correct.
right? So you get into, so for example, there is one very interesting startup which I have been involved in. It is called Willowtail. Willowtail. But
Never heard
interesting,
of
eh?
them.
Okay. So what these guys do is they say, हम तुमको village में homestay provide करेंगे, and we will brand it. So it's a little like Oyo rooms, except that the branding is around villages, and we will give you experiences in villages. So matlab, you will do things like pruning of trees, harvesting, feeding of chickens, plucking of mushrooms, vagera, 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 vagera. So they are not competing with Make My Trip, but in the travel hospitality space, they found a very interesting niche, and potentially it could be a huge niche. So in fact, Make My Trip ke through, you can actually book a Willowtail place. So you have to find your large enough niche.
Correct. So we've got some questions. One is from Bipin. Bipin is saying how investors respond to a founder if a startup fails to become revenue positive in long term.
So what's ऐसा है? First of all, I think investors जो है ना, unlike an investor in, let's say, Reliance Industries or HDFC Bank, these are investors who are angel investors and even VC. They are investors who are more forgiving. And I'll tell you why. Because they realize that of 10 companies they invest in, maybe 4 or 5 will actually die. And it will not die because the founder has done badly, but it will die because of something else. For example, so many startups have died recently because of COVID. Many fintech startups died because RBI policies changed, right? And you can't do anything about that, right? So as long as the investor feels that the founder was able to do what or did whatever he could to make the startup succeed, to survive, but still because of external factors it failed, it doesn't go against the founder, right? But what is important is, has the founder learned something from it? So in fact, if you ask me personally, there are some 4 founders of mine who have failed. Their startup has failed, but I'm very clear, tomorrow when they create a new startup, I like those guys. I like the persistence they had. I will probably invest once again in their companies, because I'm assuming they would have learned from it. So I don't blame the founder. If the founder has not, if the founder has done badly, mehnat nahi kar raha hai, or he takes terrible decisions, or he involves his family members, nepotism hai ye, then obviously the investor is going to be very, very angry, and no investor. And it's a small world. The word spreads कि भी ये founder जो है ना, इसमें पैसा मत डालो.
Yeah, I think that's another thing one has to keep in mind, that while there are so many startups being talked of, but yet it's a very small world still. There's a lot
It is
to be happening.
correct. And the world of angel investors is not very large. It's about 30,000. And many of us know the others.
Correct. And I think that's the key thing. And therefore, the same thing I've heard from other investors as well, that it's when they invest, they do not, they want it to succeed. But if it doesn't succeed, the blame does not come onto the founder per se.
Unless the founder is clearly responsible for
for it. So if the founder has shown that ability to learn, as you said, and to become better prepared for the next venture,
correct.
I think the investors are quite forgiving and many a times, as you said, still willing to invest further.
Absolutely. In fact, I would say more willing to invest, because by now I know the guy. I know the fact that he's a good guy, and therefore I will not be going in blind into his next venture.
Something that I want to ask you, Dhruv, is that you were a corporate guy and you became a faculty, and then you became an investor. How did that thing happen? I mean, in business or in corporate, everything is geared towards success only. There's no such thing like failure, or rather the failure being defined as not achieving the plan is termed as failure in corporate. How did you kind of move to that frame of mind where outcome which is not as per plan is not a failure? Because that's very important for an investor.
So I mean, personally, if you ask me, my students, many of my students at MDI, many of my alumni at MDI, they wanted to create startups, and they said, sir, can you guide us? since you had 20 years experience in industry. I used to start guiding them. Then they said, sir, paisa bhi dal do. So maine paisa bhi dal diya. And that is how I became an angel investor. But the other part of your question, see, it is not that angel investors don't want to make money. It is that angel investors realize that you will not make money in all cases. Even in the stock market, boss, you will not make money in all 100% stocks that you invest in. Some will die and some will do well, right? So, angel investing is what I would call a high risk, high return game, right? Where you invest in 10, and if you're lucky, one of those 10 will boom. Maybe 4 or 5 will fail, 4 will be okay, tick, right? But that one that booms hopefully will make up more than make up for all the others which have failed, right? So we guys accept the fact that this is a high risk, high return game, which is why clearly you have to diversify your portfolio. You cannot say, I'm only investing in, I'll put in 1 crore in one company, bas, nahi. अगर 1 करोड़ है तो 15 कंपनीज में डालो, हर एक में किसी में 5, किसी में 10 लाख डालो, right? So that diversification becomes important. I think the other important thing here is that if you have a total corpus, let's say your total savings, right? So we guys, when we came out of the corporate world, we had certain level of savings. Never, ever put the entire thing into angel investment. Mar jaoge. I mean, for example, my rule is my total corpus, not more than 5% will go into startups. The rest will go either into liquid funds or whatever, debt funds or the stock market or whatever. 5% is what I call my play money. वो मेरी बीवी ने भी अलाउ कर दिया. शी सेड चल ठीक है 5% तेरा प्ले मनी है, उसमें ऐश करनी कर, उसके आगे नहीं जाना, right? So everybody has to define for himself what that limit is, and that's the only way to manage that risk. But I must tell you, boss, it's a fascinating area. I would say I'm retiring this month, so I'm 65, right? But I would say my career is just beginning because there is so much learning that is happening here, and I must say I keep learning from youngsters, right? I learn technology, I learn new ideas. Before COVID, I used to sit in CCD and Costa Coffee with them and analyze and guide them, and they would also tell me, नहीं boss, आप गलत बोल रहे हो. बहुत मजा आता है, बहुत सीखा है. हाँ, इंशाल्लाह पैसा भी बन जाएगा कभी.
So tell me, this is very interesting how you spoke about your relationship with potential investment opportunities or startups. So let's say that a lot of people on this webinar are seeking out investment. So when they go and meet an investor, would it make sense for them to go beyond just talking business and numbers? Would it also make sense for them to create a certain relationship with the investor, make them,
Yes. Yeah,
and
absolutely.
also to challenge them,
Yes.
also to challenge the investor?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So, there are some investors. I must tell you, there are different kinds of investors. There are some guys who don't have the time. They may have the interest, but they don't have the time. They will say, boss, किसी ने analyze कर लिया, they have said, ठीक है, मोटा मोटा मुझे ठीक लग रहा है, मैं पैसा डाल रहा हूँ, उसके बाद मुझे तंग मत करो. I don't have time. Right? But there are fortunately a lot of guys who are willing to spend time. And that is actually the kind of investor you would ideally like, because that guy will then mentor you and guide you, right? And not only mentor you and guide you, he will have his contacts, he will have his network, right? That network can be used as part of your journey as a startup. So yes, the ideal investor is a guy, where it becomes a kind of mentor-mentee relationship. And incidentally, in many cases, in my case, and I think many other cases as well, there are companies which I have not invested in. They didn't need investment, but I've been mentoring them. I'm very happy, and they are also happy. They are getting hopefully some guidance from me. So yes, you're right. It is not only the money, but it is also the rest of the value that you get, that both sides get in this kind of relationship.
Right. Okay, let me just pick up some more questions which have come in. So there's one, Professor Amarnath very young faculty, very innovative, very enthusiastic about new ideas. So he's saying how much of work about what kind of activities should have been completed. The investors expect the founder should have completed before investing in a venture. So how much should the founders have done before they can get the investment into the
Okay.
venture?
So it's a fairly general question. So I'll try and I'll have to give you a slightly general answer. It varies dramatically depending on the startup. Some time back, angel investors, I'm talking of angel investors, right? When you get into, see, there are multiple layers. Layer one is friends and family, right? Where people know you, they don't ask too many questions. They say, "ठीक है, boss, I know you, 2 lakh le le and run your company." Then you have the angel investor, right? He is the first external investor in your company. And then you have the VC, the venture capitalist, right? Who will typically put in much more. Now, the first external investor, like I told you, is the angel investor, right? And typically, in an angel round, you will get anywhere between 25 lakhs and maybe 2 crores, 2.5, 3 crores, right? And each angel investor would typically put in 5 lakhs, 10 lakhs, 15 lakhs, that kind. Now, once upon a time, about 6, 7, 8 years back, people used to invest in good ideas. Boss, बहुत बढ़िया idea, great founder, makes sense, let's invest. And I have also done that, right? But we burnt our fingers because many of these companies have not done well. So in today's environment, investors have learned over time. And today investors say, boss, I need to see some proof, right? And as I said, traction is the proof. So what kind of proof do they want? If you're developing a complex product, right? So let's say you're developing a product which is in AR or VR, right? Then we want to see a proof of concept which has been accepted by 1 or 2 customers who have paid, even if the payment is only proof of concept payment. It doesn't have to be huge solid revenues, but at least a couple of people should have paid to get that proof of concept installed and tried out, right? So that is one possibility. If you don't have a product, if you're only in the service kind of industry, then you need significant revenues. And one of the thumb rules is that you need revenues of typically a few lakhs per month at a decent margin, right? Decent margin. You know, if you're getting a gross margin of only about 4 5% or 10%, then you need much higher revenues. So you need to show decent level of revenue, which typically goes into lakhs, for the investor to see enough proof. He also needs to see growth, right? And he needs to see, therefore, month on month growth. So just to give you an example, in today's world, after COVID, during COVID, uh, anybody who says, boss, I used to grow before COVID, but aaj ki date mein my business is at a standstill, investor paisa nahi dalega. Because he wants to see proof that you will be able to survive after COVID, right? So it's a generic kind of answer to a generic question. Generally, what the investor wants to see is some level of revenues. In rare cases, in a few cases, he's willing to see large number of customers, growing customer base, even without revenues, provided there is confidence that revenues will at some stage come in. वो भी होता है, but it's not that common. It's not that common. But typically, you need to see revenues, or if it's a product, proof of concept is what people normally want to see.
Right. So one of the students has asked, one investor starts to invest in some company. After some time, they find they are in losses. The company is in losses.
Right.
And the investor decides to stop investing further. So what should the startup do? Should they look for another investor? What would be the way?
So firstly, there is no question of an investor stopping investments. I think we need to understand what is happening. When an investor puts money into a startup, he has put in his money, right? He has bought shares. So he's got 10, 15, 20, whatever number of shares, and he's put in his 5 lakhs, 8 lakhs. That 5 or 8 lakhs, the investor will not take back. He can't take back because now it is part of the company, right? If the business is loss making, right? And by the way, initially, a lot of businesses will be loss making. That is accepted. That's not a problem. Right? It is accepted. Provided, See, and that's, I would say that in today's environment, things are changing. Today, once upon a time, people would look at growth at any cost. Yeah, revenue dikhao, show me your customer base doubling every 6 months. I don't care if you make a loss, मैं तुमको पैसा दूंगा. वो धीरे धीरे change हो रहा है. Now what investors are asking for is, show me a path to profitability. You may not be profitable today. I don't mind, because I know that initially you will not be profitable. You need to invest, but show me a path to profitability. So even if the business is making a loss, as long as there is a path to profitability, investors are interested. Yes, there is something that we call burn. Burn is what? Cash burn. कितना आपने खर्चा किया per month minus कितना आपने revenue लिया, right? If that burn is large and the burn keeps increasing or doesn't come down, then the investor starts thinking, कि boss problem hai. This doesn't seem to be a viable business. So as long as your burn is coming down, right, that means your business is becoming sustainable. Then the investor says, ठीक है, I am willing to give you some money so that you can grow. But basic message is, the investor will not give you money for survival. You have to start surviving on your own. Investor will give you money for growth. शुरू में investor पैसा दे देगा, शुरू में, first time. But ultimately, you have to survive on your own. But growth के लिए you can go to investors.
Okay, good. One question from Abhishek. Abhishek is one of our alumni entrepreneurs.
Okay.
And very interestingly, he's been he started a venture in Bangalore and is now wanting to start a venture in North as well. So he's asking a question: how long does the funding process takes? How from the time we approach an angel investor till the time the amount reaches our bank, and what are the steps like?
Okay.
And
so I will tell you
follow up thing to is. Please continue.
Yeah. So I will tell you what happens at lead angels, and that is more or less similar to what happens in any angel network. So first of all, what is an angel network? I need to explain that. See, once upon a time, let's say about 20 years back, right, or 15 years back, 10 years back, angel investors were very rich guys like Devinder, right? Very rich guys, Ratan Tata, Devinder Singh, Nandan Nilekani. यार मैं तुम्हारी शक्ल दिख जाती है, मैं क्या करूंगा, वो बोलना पड़ता है. अजय मोहन गोयल, right? The real rich guys. Okay. Azim Premji, okay, Narayan Murthy. These guys, they would invest. Suppose a company wanted 1 crore, they would easily put in 1 crore on their own, and they would have their own lawyers, they would have their own business analysts, they would have their own chartered accountants to do all the analysis of the company, draft the shareholder agreement, and then finally put in the money, right? आज की date में that has changed, because now angel investing has become a much more democratic process, and I have coined a term which I call Aam Aadmi angel investor. Aam Aadmi angel, right? So the Aam Aadmi angel is basically guys like me who can't put in 1 crore but who can put in 5 lakhs, right? अब Aam Aadmi angel अगर डालेगा, तो firstly, see the founder, how will he locate the Aam Aadmi angel? No founder knows that I am there as an angel investor. Plus, he needs to contact at least 100, 200 such angels to be able to get those 10 or 15 who will ultimately invest in him, right? Which is impossible. So for the startup, it's impossible. Similarly, for the angel, it's impossible because I don't have my lawyer, I don't have my chartered accountant, I don't have my business analyst. मेरे को support कहाँ से मिलेगी? So that is where the concept of angel networks came in, right? So an angel network is basically an organization. For example, Lead Angels Network is an angel network. It's an organization which has multiple startups applying for funding on one side, and which has angel investors, multiple angel investors as members of the network on the other side, right? So what happens is you approach the angel network and not an individual angel, right? And there are about 25, 30 angel networks in the country. You can see a list. You Google it and you'll be able to find enough of them, and you'll get their email IDs, their LinkedIn profile, etc., etc. So typically what you would do is the angel investment network will do all this, the business analysis, the due diligence, the shareholder agreement drafting, the term sheet drafting, vagera, and the collection of the money on behalf of the startup. So it's a boon for the startup founder, and it's also a boon for the angel investor, because he couldn't have done it on his own. So now, if you want to get money, if you want to get funded, you will typically go to an angel network like Lead Angels. Normally, when you apply, there will be a process of shortlisting. Based on the shortlisting, then a presentation is made to the members, and then the members decide, boss, this seems to be of interest, isko chodo, not of interest. Then something which is of interest is analyzed in more detail. फिर term sheet sign होती है, valuation discuss होती है, right? Then you will have things like accounting due diligence, legal due diligence, and finally the shareholder agreement is signed and money is taken. And this process normally takes anywhere between 3 and 4 months, normally. However, it can stretch. For example, there are startups who have come to us. Investors will only invest in a private limited company. There are startups who have come to us. They have a partnership. अब उस partnership को पहले convert करना है into a private limited company. That will take extra time, right? So sometimes it does stretch, but 3 to 4 months is a good ballpark estimate to go with.
Great. You spoke about this, that a lot more investors are there now than in the past. And we are also seeing, that a lot of family office are coming into angel investment.
Yeah.
So how do you see that panning out? The younger generation from established families are now getting into angel networking or angel investing. How is that going to play along with the angel networks of Aam Aadmi network?
So by the way, that's fairly big. You're right. That's happening. Premji has his family office. This guy Kunal Behel of Snapdeal, they have their own office. It's called, I think, Titan Capital, right? So yes, that's happening. There is one other interesting thing which is happening, which is the family office. For example, I'll tell you, Premji, the Wipro. Now there is Wipro Consumer Care, right? Wipro Consumer is a different company, unlike Wipro, the hardware and software company, right? So Wipro Consumer is into basically what? Shikakai oil and sunflower oil and Shikakai soap and so on, right? Consumer products. They have now created a fund where they say we will only invest in consumer industries. And one very interesting reason why are they investing only in consumer industries is that is not a financial investment. देखो बस VC और जो angel होता है, their investment is a financial investment. मैंने पैसा डाला, 4 साल बाद 5 साल बाद मुझे वापस चाहिए at X times the valuation. मुझे exit चाहिए. ये जो लोग हैं, ये they may not necessarily look for an exit. They basically look at this as an extension of their existing business. So many of these young guys, the second generation, third generation entrepreneurs from family businesses, they are trying to diversify into allied areas. And rather than doing it from scratch, they are saying, let us identify a startup, put money into that, and then over time we will put in more and more money, and that becomes a kind of subsidiary to our existing business. So that's one good direction that the world is moving in. And you're right, family office is a very major source of startup funding.
So if any of the would these guys look at, would they be willing to go in early into a venture, or they would look for they will wait longer than, let's say, people like yourself before they will go and start investing?
I would say,
like, let's say, Pro Consumer.
Yeah, I would say it would probably vary, because, one of the advantages these guys have is they understand that area far better than I would or any normal angel investor would, right? If it's an allied area, so let's say there is a guy in, say, the logistics business, right? Somebody in couriers or air freight. If he were to invest in something in the logistics business, he already understands it threadbare, right? And therefore, his willingness to take a risk at an earlier stage may be higher, right? That is one part. But on the other hand, if you have funds which are pure financial investments, then funds normally invest at a later stage. So it'll vary. It'll really vary depending on what that purpose, that guy's purpose is.
All right. So before we close, let me ask you, what are some of the interesting industries or fields are you looking at right now, which are there in front of you for seeking investment?
Okay, so right now, anything which is being negatively impacted by COVID is right now not on the investment horizon of any investor, right? Till things normalize, because you don't know how long it will take. You don't know to what extent it will get normalized, right? So restaurants, hotels, travel, आज की डेट में कोई इन्वेस्ट नहीं कर रहा है, number one. Number two, areas which are positively impacted, right? Those are hot areas. So for example, ed tech, right? Anything to do with online education is a very hot topic right now, although it is now getting crowded because there are probably too many people in this space. However, I'll just clarify one thing. Like I said, if you have a crowded space, identify a large enough niche. So I'll give you one very simple example, Devinder. There is one interesting company I have invested in. It is called Oki Poki. Oki Poki is it's a character, it's a cartoon character. It is a baby octopus. Uska naam hai Oki Poki. Okay? So this guy, he wanted to get into the online education space, because online is growing, is booming, right? You can see what is happening to Byju's and co. But this guy realized it's a very crowded space. There are just too many people doing conventional online teaching. So he says, okay, I will look at a niche. There is a huge number of people in India who come from families and family backgrounds where English is not spoken, right? So you may be speaking Hindi, you may be speaking Gujarati, you may be speaking whatever, Odia, Punjabi, jo bhi hai. So, but there is an aspiration to learn English because employability in many cases is related to your ability to know English. So this guy has launched Oki Poki, which is basically aimed at kids who are in the age group of 2 to 6 or 7. All he is doing is he is teaching them spoken English, right? जो कि उनको घर में, स्कूल में environment नहीं मिलता है. It's a huge market, but it's a niche within the education space. Right? So online education is becoming a very major space. Health is becoming a very major area, especially after COVID, because people are very concerned, about health and immunity. One space which has not been negatively impacted is the agriculture space. So agri-tech is becoming a very interesting space. A lot of investors are looking at investing in it. So these are broadly the areas, apart from the standard high-tech areas. Anything in virtual reality, augmented reality, anything in blockchain, anything in machine learning, these are always hot areas.
Right. Great. I think we've overshot our time by 10 minutes. So thank you so much for giving your time. It's been lovely talking to you as ever. Time flies when one is with you. So I'd like to thank you for taking time out, being here on this platform, and sharing your thoughts. I'd also like to thank all the people who came in today. Hope this was worth a while for you, and I'm sure many of you would be interested to get connected with Mr. Dhruv Nath. Kindly drop in an email to us. You would have received the invite through Bhagat or to Propel. We'll be happy to take your contact details and just write a small brief note which we can forward to Mr. Dhruv Nath for him to consider and connect with you. Thank you so much, everybody.
Sure.
Please stay safe.
Absolutely.
And thank you, Dhruvji, again. Hopefully, when things become better, we will bring you over to the campus as well, to incubator. I know it's a distance, and I would like to share a cup of tea with you at our campus.
Yes,
I'll offer
absolutely.
you that thing. Thank you so
Great,
much.
wonderful.
Lovely.
Thanks, Devinder. Thanks.
you.
Nice meeting you, Ajay, and thanks everybody. Have fun, all of you.
Thank
And
you.
don't worry, COVID will go away. Don't worry.
It will.
मेरी गारंटी है, COVID जाएगा.